the CAN Thought Leadership Series. It's good to have you back with us. Today, we're honored to have among the most respected educators in the country, Angelica Infante-Green, Andres Alonso, Norman Atkins, and David Steiner in conversation on the topic, making the most of high school years. Having sat in on a practice session last week, I can say you're in for an invaluable opportunity to understand where we're at, how we got here, and how our wise thought leaders sharing their visions for what the future could look like. In these complicated times, every high school educator, student, and parent would benefit from this one-of-a-kind conversation we're about to hear. I'd also like to mention we'll follow up this extraordinary event with another significant event on January 17th. This will feature Paul LeBlanc, the president of Southern New Hampshire University, and a panel of distinguished thought leaders on the crucial topic, Students First in K-12. I hope you'll join us then. For now, a moment we've been very much looking forward to. I thank all of today's awesome thought leaders for being with us. I thank our audience, many from the noblest of professions, educators, for joining us, and I welcome with great respect David Steiner, who will start this stimulating conversation off. David?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. Pleasure to be with you. It's my task, a rather unfortunate one and a very quick one, to suggest why we have a problem at all. And to put it in very stark terms, if we look at the performance in mathematics and in English language arts of our current American high school students, it is essentially what it was in 2005. In fact, is exactly what it was in 2005. Unfortunately, the scores have been decreasing for the lowest performing students, usually those from our most underprivileged economic backgrounds, and so often, tragically, also students of color. They are getting left behind even more so than ever. So the gap between the haves and the have-nots in our society is in fact increasing. Secondly, we send these students onwards to a variety of places, amongst which are community colleges. We find there that 42% of the first year students at those colleges need remediation, so almost half. Unsurprising perhaps, because in their high school, we know that only 32% of 11th graders said they felt engaged in school. 32% compared with 74% of fifth graders. So essentially every year that our children stay in school, they feel less engaged. And we know from other data that this matches their academic learning. Every year they stay in an American public school, on average, students in the United States learn less than they did the year before. Finally, we know that there is a mismatch between what happens next in terms of the job market and the skills and readiness that our students have for that market. It turns out that 52% of jobs by educational requirement in the United States require a high school degree and some kind of skills training. But the data from community colleges and from our CTE programs show that we are largely failing to prepare students for those opportunities. There is a deep mismatch between what we're creating and what our markets could use in terms of gainful employment. It is therefore a real problem, a deep problem, and one that I think we need to face squarely. And thus, I'm very, very happy to give the floor over to Andres to talk to us about how we got into this mess.
So beautifully concise, David. Hope I can match you. The irony of what David said is that at the same time that these outcomes are going down, the graduation rate is going up, especially among the poor children and children of color. So there's this huge disconnect between what we're seeing when we compare our performance with those of students in other countries, especially in our own national tests, and what we're actually seeing in terms of the behavior of schools in pushing students forward. and providing necessary supports. The other interesting irony in the conversation is that even though our schools are part of an extraordinarily loose system of schools where you have a very soft federal control and 50 different policy environments at the state level, and 15,000 districts that have enormous broadband and degrees of autonomy around what happens in classrooms and schools. Most high schools in this country look very similar to each other. They're a set of cultural elements at play that have resulted in tremendous standardization around structures and processes, even though there is tremendous variability in terms of learning and student attainment. A great deal of that has to do with one of the great achievements of an institution that I was once the chair of, which is the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Learning, which introduced the Carnegie unit around the turn of the last century, which tied attainment and movement in high schools and to a certain degree in college to seat time, time spent learning, so that we, in most schools in the country, you have semesters, half credit for each semester, 120 hours of seat time to generate a credit, students being pushed forward towards the 120 credits, and then this disconnect between where they end up and the demonstration of learning. There is also the extraordinary reality of continued tracking in our schools, even while the policy environment and a lot of the work of the last 20 years around curriculum has pushed towards higher standards and graded achievement for our students. The other interesting fact is that for the last 45 years, we have thrown the sink at schools and high schools around school reform. It started with the civil rights and the war on poverty, with a Nation at Risk report in the 1980s. There was enormous emphasis on what we needed to do with our schools. We had the comprehensive school movement, the accountability push of the 2000s, the Common Core, small schools as a strategy, academies as a strategy. And yet you heard the aggregation of those results in David's summary. So, what do we do about it? That's part of our conversation, and I'm going to hand over the conversation to Commissioner Angelica Infante-Green, a former colleague, to ask her, where do we start? What's the recommendation? Can we come together around a vision of how to improve our high schools?
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Alonso. You think I'd get that right by now, huh? So I think it's an interesting and a powerful question. One of the things that we have been working on is really including student voice and what that needs to look like. I think we've tried, like you mentioned, so many different approaches. I think we've looked at different movements, but at no point did we really bring in the student voice. Where do they feel that? And they're pretty articulate in how we have failed or the system has failed them. And we did some research in the last 5 years where we followed our students in our state colleges. And what we saw was pretty devastating. Exactly what David Steiner was talking about. The longer they're with us, the worse they do. And they would graduate our system, and then they would drop out of college 2 years later. That was the trajectory. Some kids, it took them 10 years. We followed them for 10 years, and we found that every single time. And we heard from the students that went out of state. We didn't collect all the data because we don't have a system that does that. We only can do what's in Rhode Island. But what we found was devastating because one, they didn't feel prepared when they went to college. Two, they didn't feel like they were learning things that were of interest to them or that were actually useful. And if you were a child in poverty, the game has changed. So we have seen, especially with the pandemic, that post-secondary accreditation has disappeared for those kinds of employments for our students. So what are we doing? What are we putting in place that values the reality of the students, that we continue to keep the standards high because we don't want to change that. One of the things that we have in Rhode Island is that we don't have to have proficiency to graduate. So you can graduate, but that's it, right? That's it. You're not going to go much further. So part of what we're doing is sort of revamping our secondary regulations. I know you just talked about that, but there has to be some sort of criteria. Like, what have you learned? And what are the things that we value? What we've learned during the pandemic right now is that the way that we have our secondary schools structured don't meet the needs of our current population, especially our kids of color, our multilingual learners. A lot of those kids, our kids, have to work. And that's a reality that we have always tried to kind of force into our system. And one of the things that we're trying to do is make it more flexible. You know, why does school have to start at one time and end at another? Like, why can't it start at 7 o'clock in the morning and go till 10 o'clock at night, and kids could come in and out and, and then actually get credit for what they're doing, for their work, for their responsibilities. So we've learned a lot during the pandemic about what needs to change for us. And the way that we've done that is really engaging the students. And this summer, we held summer school throughout the state. We broke down the urban, suburban barriers, had kids together, and they told us what they needed, and they helped us design the courses. And what we saw was 50-point gain in math for the kids on the SAT that participated. Like, we could track those kids, and the ones that were further behind that came in from other districts, more the urbans that had more of a gap, they actually saw a 100-point gain. So there's something to be said for bringing the student voice in. And we have the luxury of working with the Bar Foundation right now, as well as with XQ, Lorraine Jobs, and Russell and Ali have put together XQ. And it is an opportunity for us to redesign secondary schools with students, right? Not, the bureaucrats like ourselves kind of dictating what should happen, setting the parameters, but letting them help us redesign the schools. So that's where we are as we're having this conversation, and really creating different pathways. Like, it's not one or the other, it's everything. Like, how do we expose kids to everything and give them the opportunity to be able to have a profession and pay for college? Like, we're working with industry professionals to try to incorporate that in all our secondary schools. So I am going to turn it over, because I have a tendency of over talking, to Norm. And what does the future look like?
Thanks, Angelica. That was great. And I am not adding student voice here, although I talk to students all the time, and I was one once. So just to be provocative, I'll share a more kind of radical envelope for high school. Before I do, I guess reforming the high school without a bunch of other things is probably not going to work. So I'm going to stipulate that sort of high on the agenda is the science of reading, and teaching students to read when they start in school would be number one. And secondly would be something, Angelica, you alluded to, which is just maintaining sort of rigorous instruction and high standards, and sort of more solid, reliable, evidence-based instructional materials, K to 8. And then third, it was really interesting hearing what you had to say about the summer project. I think that so long as our housing patterns are what they are, and that we track students from the earliest age, we're going to isolate students and not sort of create a universal sense of belonging and help students across race and class. So assuming that we address those things, my proposal would be that high school be 9th and 10th grade, and that we essentially try to achieve by 10th grade what we're currently saying we're doing by 12th grade. Keep the standards high, have some sort of exit assessment that means something, teach books and the humanities and the sciences up until 10th grade, and then essentially go in the direction that you started to, Angelica, which is around flexibility. Let's call 11th and 12th grade early college. And essentially, I think it's sort of 5 elements. First, just give students the choice of a handful of different pathways. One could be very traditional liberal arts college prep. Another could be prep for careers in the STEM fields. Another could be around service learning, and another could be career-connected learning, all of which would yield college credit, ideally, and force the colleges and universities to kind of backward map what they're expecting for students when they get into the university programs. And obviously, it would dramatically drive down the cost of higher education. It would be much more meaningful for students. And then third, I think we have to basically recognize that we're limited on choice within the buildings that we have. And essentially, we have to give students the opportunity to take classes synchronous, asynchronous, online, across the board, so that they can benefit from the expertise and opportunities nationwide. And then fourth, given that it's not either or with respect to in-person experiences, we really have to pay attention to this issue of belonging and create opportunities. You just gave a great example of what you could do in the summer, but create opportunities for people to get together across interest, across race, across class, to be part of the same society. We need to rethink the way we're doing co-curriculars, which are right now very building-based. And then last, we probably have to reconceptualize the role of the teachers in the program, which is to say that teachers are vital to the solution, but they're insufficient in and of themselves to be able to deliver on all the things that we've just shared. And so I would sort of modestly say that we need teachers in 11th and 12th grade or early college to be behaving more like coaches and advisors and working on student motivation and relationship, but are not responsible for delivering the content that students need, and that we bring in experts and people from the outside world and give students field-based experiences during those last 2 years of school. I'll stop there, and who wants to go next? David?
Sure. Thanks, Norman. And first to say that I'm very strongly sympathetic to what was just said by both of you. Had the privilege of serving on one of the endless commissions that from time to time look at these things, in this case in Maryland, the Kirwan Commission. And we in fact endorsed the idea of a 10th grade assessment with options to follow. So what Norman is saying is not pie in the sky. It can be real. And it's, of course, what Switzerland does, one of the world's most productive economies with excellent career and technical possibilities, as well as college tracks. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say is, as Norman pointed out, we can't just start with high school. And my particular anguish is the sort of class system we've established among academic subjects in those previous years, where math and English are somehow first class, history and science are kind of second, and then everyone else is third. No other country in the world I know of behaves this way, as if, you know, those are the two subjects that you've got to be good at or you're sunk. Most people don't realize there are 38 AP subject exams. Well, there's no point in having 38 AP subject exams if your school has undermined any possible deep preparation in anything but 2 or 3 subjects. So we have to dismantle that kind of subject-based hierarchy as a condition for opening up the kind of choices and options that Norman rightly lays before us. Secondly, on the point of connectivity, I would put Norman's point in a slightly different frame, which is motivation, right? We have to reestablish a fundamental set of motivations for high school students to pay attention to something. Right now, if we look at ACT and SAT, for example, those are designed and were designed as aptitude tests, not subject matter tests. Well, that fundamentally cuts the relationship between my effort in a classroom and my college pathway, because my working hard at history has no point if the college is focused on an SAT score. What makes it worse is the correlation between college performance and an ACT score is about 24 to 27%. It is a very low correlation. So these tests don't do a good job anyway. So in most countries, the subject matter study leads to the next opportunity. And we have to rebuild that pipeline. So whether it's a very, very high quality career or technical option, which is signed on by the industry involved or by the financial sector, whether it is a community college that has an articulation agreement with industry, whether it is a four-year college, as in my case, when I grew up in England, that says you need to do this well on your science subjects, your English, your math, your foreign language, your arts, your economics, and we will recognize that success, and you then will come to us, right? We have to break down what has become a complete disconnect in terms of motivation. Otherwise, we shouldn't be surprised that the students are totally, AWOL when it comes to high school. And then I think that the third thing I want to say, and this is more difficult, but we have to stop lying. 36% of the Baltimore graduates over the last few years, high school graduates, graduated thanks to something called the Bridge Project, which they took because they couldn't meet the minimum, very modest assessment standards. When I asked as a state board member in Maryland, how many people failed the Bridge Project, it turns out no one knew, and most people think nobody. So we're simply giving a signal that high school graduation is an open door with no serious standards. When we haven't set up the linkages I just described, that's probably the only honest thing we should say, right? Is that, sorry, we broke the continuation between high school and what comes next in all sorts of serious ways. Therefore, we're just going to give you the diploma. But that's a race to the bottom. That is a version of the soft bigotry of low expectations. And finally, it seems to me, on the other side of that, what we have to break is the very, very deep-seated view in the United States that anything but college is somehow this dreadful, it's like this woodworking. Not that I have anything against woodworkers, it can be beautiful stuff, but it's a cliche that the career and technical is the woodworking track, and it's for those who can't compete and can't manage. Switzerland measured the income of its citizens 10 years after they made that choice between career and technical and four-year college. 65%, by the way, currently make the choice for the career and technical. And they couldn't tell the incomes apart. Right? We have to face the fact that our job market, our evolving needs for skills do not match this mania for going to college and then dropping out, which is seemingly what we have achieved for so many of the less fortunate of our students. Andres.
So I so agree with so much of what was already spoken and put on the table, and I'm going to take elements of it. And first of all, I think that we need to separate what has to happen at the level of policy and what has to happen at the level of implementation. What has to become part of systems and what has to become part of changes in behavior on the part of individuals. In order to then create clear pathways for the field in terms of opportunities and huge challenges. And one thing that I kept thinking about when you were all speaking is how much schools are part of an ecology of schooling, an ecology around group identity, an ecology around class, an ecology around economy and economics, and how all these different elements are interdependent and contribute to what goes on in the high school. So for example, there is this huge disconnect among the levels of schooling in the K-12 system that passes the buck in a way that is similar to what David just described. It doesn't just happen from the high school to the 16 to 20 system or the work system. It happens at the elementary level, and it happens at the middle school level, and then it happens on the high school level. There's a kind of forwarding the ultimate accountability for what happens in schools. I shouldn't say accountability, the ultimate responsibility. So the next level is always looking at the previous level for the reason why the schools don't achieve, which is remarkable. So at the policy level, and at the level of leadership, there has to be a way to create accountability points and responsibility points, which lead to everyone owning what happens in the life of an individual child, which, by the way, we're able to do now in a way that we were not able to do 20 years ago, because one of the outcomes of NCLB and then what happens later with Race to the Top is that we now have longitudinal data systems that we did not have in the past. In the past, you couldn't follow a child's progress from beginning to end. You couldn't follow what was happening in terms of teacher effectiveness over the life of a child. So there are tools that we have now that potentially allow us to now own the progress of a child in ways that we didn't have in the past. We need to use them as opposed to keeping the same accountability tools. So what happens in the life of a child, in the life of schools, within a community or across communities, because we also have extraordinary mobilities in places like Baltimore. Mm-hmm. So how do we then basically own the life of a child? So by the time they get to high school, if they're behind, there are supports and interventions so that something happens in those first 2 years that Norman referred to, which are so key, rather than the funnel that happens in the 9th school in most urban high schools that leads to the huge dropout rate at the end of the 9th grade and at the end of the 10th grade. I mean, the present practice is that 30 to 40% of the kids get there, stay in 9th grade for more than 1 or 2 years, and then drop out. Those are the dropouts. So it's, you know, the structural change is not going to lead to a difference without something else happening around the content, the density of the interventions, both the ambition and the sense of responsibility in terms of what's happening in those 2 years. That's my sense of what needs to happen at the local level. The second component that I wanted to build on, because I think it's responsive to what you were all feeling. That's not me. It's the how high schools interact with the next levels, whether the world of work, the community college, where a lot of the kids are getting fed into the community college system, not into the 4-year system. And Norman has this great idea of bringing the content downwards, which I completely endorse. And the question is, how do we do that? Which I think requires an enormous human capital investment, an enormous investment around resources. The reality is, David, that the career and technical education system has been revolutionized in the last 20 years or so. So that it's no longer woodworking. As a matter of fact, if you just look at Baltimore, most of the career and technical education schools have entrance requirements that actually make them magnet schools. So many of the kids that are in the greatest need of career and technical education pathways are shut out of the career and technical education schools, because the hidden fact is that so many parents in Latino and African American communities still endorse and support career and technical educations, while many of the most progressive minds in the countries sometimes look at career and education, quote unquote, tracks as a mechanism of withdrawing opportunities to college attainment. And especially with the requirements that are now in place in terms of federal funding and state funding, and Commissioner Green can tell us more about that. It's, the career and technical education schools are in a bind in terms of what they need to do in order to maintain their accreditation for the funding. So secondly, how do you in implementation, how do you bring in this idea of bringing down the content and the requirements in ways that address the fact that, in places like Philadelphia, Cleveland, St. Louis, 20 to 30% of the kids are going to come in, and they're in reality, they're candidates for alternative forms of education. Without the supports and without the systems that should be in place, they end up in comprehensive schools, but what they require is something with a great deal more of acceleration and density of supports and instruction. So how does that happen when so much of the system is built around these components that have been unchanged over time? This is why Angelica's point about what was happening during the pandemic is tremendously appealing to me. Okay, but then that leads to the third component, which is that we're going to need a revolution around human capital and around leadership, because if we just move down if we shift the requirements and ask people to do in a radically different way, while dealing with some of the same challenges, what we can predict is that they're going to somehow end up with the same outcome. So what happens around teacher training? What happens around supports? What happens around leadership development? And Norman, you can tell us a lot more about that, since you do great work in that area. So and so do you, David. So how do we then radically shift what's happening around the schools so that the work of the schools can be radically different? And potentially that leads us to the question of what gets in the way. Because if we go back 30, 40 years to the effective school movements, I just reread Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's great The Good School. What an amazing book around schools that work. And we've known for 40, 50 years what needs to happen in an individual school in order to serve kids. I mean, we've known what the definition of the good is, and yet it's been impossible to bring it to scale at the level of systems that are local systems, let alone at the level of states, which David and Angelica have been in charge of states. And I get, and of course, what happens at the level of the country matters tremendously. So that to me is where the rubber hits the road, as in we kind of know, think about how similar our ideas are in some ways. We kind of know what some of the pieces might be. What then gets in the way, and what needs to happen around
Commissioner, what
the rubber hits the road?
How do you
Commissioner?
So I'm really excited with this conversation because this is exactly what Norma said, David and Andres. I mean, it is what we're grappling with right now, right? So it is when we are reinventing, and I hate that word because it feels like part of all this reform movement, but we're reimagining what that could be in Rhode Island. And I mentioned earlier that we didn't have a criteria for graduating. You just have to take the SAT, basically. So we are, which is ridiculous because we are not preparing kids. So we are revamping. So it goes to what Andres said. So we're looking at a state level. Then I have the pleasure of overseeing Providence School District. So I'm doing kind of a state level, district level, thanks to David Steiner. And what we see playing out is a couple of things. So during the pandemic, we had our 12th graders take college courses, finish their senior year and take college courses. But there's a subset of kids that weren't ready. They just weren't ready. We tried and they just couldn't do it. So what we went back is that we have to establish different models and blow up what we think. We know what the elements are. And at a policy level, we are changing our diploma so that there is proficiency because it has to mean something. 2, what does that diploma really value? It's not just going to school, but also getting credit for CTE and making sure that our kids have exposure to CTE starting in the middle school. We have something called Prepare RI, where all our junior students have to go into industry and they have to work in the industry for that year. They get paid and they explore different possibilities. So that's something that we've partnered with our industry here in Rhode Island to make happen. Our former governor, who's now the Secretary of Commerce, this was something that she was really big on. So we've been doing that so that all our students have the ability, and now we're putting it on the diploma because that is also important. We have to figure out it's not one or the other. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes one is not better than the other. We have put out, we have cybersecurity as a CTE program, but we don't have that. You have to test into it. Because what we did the last 2 summers when we did statewide is that we put kids that would not have normally been ready into these AP courses, and they actually did well. They were with different peers. You know, the standard, what our expectations are for the students matter. They matter because how you teach them matters. Then we also, back to Andres's point, that some kids were not ready. Where is the accountability or responsibility lie? If kids are getting to the 9th grade, and I'm sorry, David, just talk about reading, and can't read, that's great about the responsibility, but it is now our responsibility in whatever grade that that child is in to make it work. So we started a 9th grade academy in Providence, and we have reading specialists, we have math specialists, we have social studies teachers that go down to the core. So we're giving them extra time there. It's a longer day, and we're giving them the basics or I don't want to make it sound like it's basic, but if they're struggling in an area, it is our job to make sure that they have those supports. It is not the student's fault, but it is our responsibility to make that up. So our 9th grade academy throughout the city looks totally different. Something we just did this year, and we also have that pathway. But I think the other piece that I think is really important that Andres was talking about is what we learned during the pandemic. In-person does matter. It just really does. We saw kids that really struggled online, and we can do a combination of things. I don't think it's one or the other, but I think we have to figure out what works for who. And we have not learned how to do that while maintaining the standard high. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have. And then bringing the community in. I think for a long time, we've sort of told the community what they need. And it's time that the community also takes part in how we move forward together. And I think that's going to be a big challenge and a big shift for us. So it's raising the standard, making CTE, college preparedness, bringing it down. I do agree, Norman, but we have to make sure that the kids are successful. Because if we bring it down and we have all these courses at high school and the kids don't do well, then they also get disenchanted and don't want to continue to move forward. And that goes to say that our college professors don't know how to give that support that the kids need. And we don't want our kids funneled into community college only. You know, they should have other options. And I think for us, we have made community college free. So that becomes sort of a pipeline for kids that don't have other economic means. So we have to be very careful with our policy, well-meaning, well-intentioned, but without all the other pieces in at the same time.
Norman, thoughts?
I want to put in a plug for just doing school better. Like I think that, you know, we're sort of rushing to talk about setting up students for jobs and careers and what to do about everybody who's struggling most. I'd say that, so one of the lessons that I've derived from Uncommon Schools from the past 25 years is that when you expect low-income students to achieve at the highest level, and you give them adequate resources and good teachers and people who believe in them, and you create relationships and you put in front of them rigorous texts and instruction, they will do well. And so it's like we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're sort of stipulating that you have to have high expectations for everybody, regardless of where they're from. I'm wondering what's the order of operations? Like I think you could quickly go from a modified, pragmatic, utopic vision, and then Andres, you could bring us down and say, like, it'll never happen because here are all the ways in which we're going to get stuck. I wonder from the group, like, where would you begin? So I know what to do at the school level. I know what to even do at the sort of network of school level. But I think, Andres, you're raising some good points. When I hear you talk, I think like the number one thing that I would try to address first would be the policies around high school graduation requirements. You started talking about the Carnegie unit, which is 120 years old. Whether it's through sort of redefining what the Carnegie unit is, or saying whether you need 40 years of PE in order to graduate, like, let's just change the expectation for what you have to do in high school, and then you open up the sluice gates of innovation along the lines of some of the things that we're describing.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I would sort of go for a moment, sort of the balmy philosopher, if I may, which is where I started, which is that we have a set of global problems that are real because they impact the behavior of many, many folks every day in our schools. We are in a culture in which knowledge is under attack, knowledge as such. And that is a very dangerous situation to be in, because it has lots of allies. It has allies in shooting the assessment messenger, for example, right? If knowledge is fundamentally suspect, then every test is suspect, right? Then it's like saying we've lost faith in the distinction between health and illness, therefore we throw out the thermometer, right? That is one of many effects. Second effect is we get very skeptical about teachers having to know anything. Because if knowledge is devalued, then caring about your children, your kids, which is very important, right, becomes the end all and be all, and states have every reason to chase to the bottom, right, to start bottom feeding. And that's very dangerous, because what happens is the worst off of our kids end up getting the worst trained and frankly, the most modestly educated teachers. So anti-intellectualism has long been an issue in the United States. Hofstadter's famous book about it in the 60s. But what's deeper now is a political push to say, let your own rage, right, replace your own frustration, your own anger, your own sense of dislocation. Let that replace any kind of respect for knowing and knowledge. And one perhaps apparently more benign example, if I may, everyone talks about the metacognitive skills, right? I invite everyone in the audience to start thinking critically about nothing in particular, right? It's not so easy, right? Critical thinking has to be about something. We don't pay surgeons and airplane pilots and engineers to think critically about nothing. They know a great deal about which to think. And this sense that, you know, whatever I want and feel and I'm angry about is to be reflected in the schools is going to be very, very corrosive of everything we're talking about, unless we find a robust way to push back.
So part of what I meant in my push earlier, Norman, was not a skepticism about the reform agenda that you set forth. Is a strong sense that unless elements of that reform agenda are operationalized with a clear understanding of behavior on the ground and the incentive structure on the ground, and the responsibility by the different levels of government, of the different public agencies, the different elements, the different actors that are engaged in this work of pushing children forward, then we end up with some of the debates of the last, 2 decades, and the endless
100%.
sort of like reinventing of the wheel. So for
100%.
example, of course, I'm sure you agree. For example, this notion of children are graduating and there's no need for a real demonstration of knowledge. Who owns that? Well, that's at some level that's a policy element. But it's also an element that schools should own, even though most public schools tend to be about compliance and about someone else defining the set of elements that pushes children forward. So something has to happen at the level of state policy. Something has to happen at the level of what should be the work of boards of education, which have extraordinary power, which they often use in the wrong ways. And then something has to happen at the level of the school, where you have many phenomenal schools who engage in the work of defining for themselves what children should know and be able to do, and use that as the mechanism for identity and for this defining the task in an everyday way and in a way that aggregates to what happens with children down the line. But then you have many other places that are waiting for schools to tell them, what's the curriculum, what's the scope and sequence, how does it get measured? You have problems around measurement, where for the past 20 years there was this accountability push that I applauded, but got in the way of it had all kinds of perverse externalities around how school experience what was supposed to be about learning and became about something else. So I worry about huge policy shifts without thinking through the elements that become the matter of the stuff of how educators, parents, students engage with that work. And I think we need to think about those components. So that my sense is that we start with this notion of what should children know and be able to do, which has a state component. It has a local component at the level of whether it's a public school system or a private school system or a charter school system. And then it has a component that schools should be intelligent entities, and we should be engaging them in that conversation in ways that then allows for real thinking and real engagement around what that looks at the level of the classroom. So that's the beginning, and then you map backwards, and that kind of of conversation has to relate to the question of what comes next. I mean, the backward mapping is happening at all, should be happening at all different levels of that ecology that includes the community colleges, et cetera, et cetera. And then, David, I'm about to pass it back to you, don't worry.
No, I want to open it for questions because we have less than 10 minutes.
Okay, and then, thank you, I was supposed to do that. And then you then have to engage the partners who are consequentially involved in the conversation, like businesses, like community. And of course, the main actors should be the students. Okay, David, you took the baton.
No, I just wanted to point out that we have now just 8 minutes for questions. And so I do want to respect the fact that our audience should be asking. I do see that we have one. Commissioner, do you want to take the question that's on it? It's, I'm an assistant superintendent of a 2-school high school district. What can I do to move my buildings in this direction? What would be the budget plans and programs? Right, this person can't change state rules. So this is really a principles question, right? You want to?
Yeah. So to put all these elements together right now, at this moment, we actually have money. And how we utilize this money is going to be really important. And so as you think about it, going back to Andres and related to your question together, where do we start? You have to start all around the continuum. You can't just start in one place. It sort of has to meet in all the spaces at the same time. So if you have 2 high schools, you have to start going back and where are you introducing kids? What are your kids? Where are the benchmarks that you have for your district? Like where are you measuring? What does that look like? And what are the supports that you're putting in place? And then how do you bring industry to the table? What are the local industries? What are the national industries? And you can actually add things to your diploma. You don't have to wait for the state. You can push forward. The state is very slow. We set the parameters, but you can push the envelope. You can go further than the state. And you can say, in my 2 schools, these are the criteria that I hold above and beyond what the state is requiring, because usually the state requires the minimum. So you have to bring the industry partners to the table and have them put money in as well, because they benefit from a workforce that's prepared, and that whether they go to college or not, but your local community, and believe it or not, politicians have a stake in this. They can give you money aside from the money that you have right now, because what my fear is that we invest right now and we'll do what we did in Race to the Top, that then we had all these people that we could not sustain. It can't just be about bringing people into our system right now, but it really has to be about setting up those structures at all levels, starting those structures so they all meet at some point. So bring in industry, bring them in, bring in the parents so that you could change the perspective and hold everybody to the highest standards, and you could rewrite that. I'm telling you, you have the ability and the power to do that at the district level.
Norman, any thoughts?
On the question, somebody asked, how do we bring industry and business to the table to offer students these essential opportunities? I'd say that you mentioned the Swiss system. Both in Switzerland and Germany, the vast middle of the nation's youth essentially participate in an apprenticeship system from the age of 16. People in Denver and Elkhart, Indiana, and Washington, D.C. and New York City who are trying to implement aspects of that system in the U.S. I think it's difficult to scale in the U.S., but essentially they go and canvass local employers and get them to commit to serving a certain number of apprentice positions. I think we need to this issue of backward mapping. We need a backward map from the various industries, the specific skills that are needed for the entry-level positions that they're hiring for, and we need to do that in concert with the colleges. And we need to think about both standards for the specific jobs and industries and the kind of professional skills that our young people will need in order to be able to broadly go into the workforce.
We've got a question, since 2 of you, both Andres and you, just spoke about backward mapping, what it really means.
What it means is that you start with an aspirational desired outcome, and then you figure out all the things that have to happen along the way from the start in order to get us there in a way that then allows us to support it and provide the necessary elements for it to happen. I mean, we just don't want to spring something on our school. I couldn't agree more with what Norman said, and together with this issue, with this notion of apprenticeship, which I think is so keenly tied to social emotional learning, to engagement, with a sense of belonging in a community that we know is so important in terms of what happens down the line. Something has to radically change this idea of exploration in learning, that it's what we all ended up doing in our college education and in our work life, which kept us engaged along the way. That's not what's happening in most high school classes in the country. So that element of intellectual value and engagement in the work has to start in the way that it happens in a lot of early education classes. The kids are always exploring, and then we get into a place where it's all about remediation. That's the backward mapping that we're talking about. Something has to happen along the way.
One thing I would add on the career and technical, I had the privilege of being in Anderson, South Carolina, and seeing one of the most extraordinary world-class career and technical centers with advanced robotics and lasers and pilot simulators and so on and so forth. And I worry that when I compare that with some of what I've seen in Baltimore, which I'm speaking to you from, and where I have the privilege of working with hundreds of successors, we have to be careful not to recreate the very hierarchy that we had in higher education, with the sorting of students by income largely and zip code into different potential opportunities one more time in career and technical, right? We have to make this democratic. We have to enable these doors and possibilities and tracks and choices that Norman spoke of. Those have to be democratically and based on an equality of access, a quality of opportunity of access. And that takes us all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, which is that the K-8 education, right, has to dig in. We shouldn't have fourth graders who can't decode. And that's what we're facing in many cities in this country. So all of our hopes and aspirations for the rich choices, the connections to what comes next, the capacity for children to really exercise their imaginations and their hopes and dreams, those are stillborn if they get to ninth grade and as the commissioner said, can't read, right? And then we've done nothing but give them, full storms and full skateways. So hopefully we will move forward.
Can I answer one of the questions?
Please close with your thoughts.
Well, there was a question about the industry, what role do they play in the schools? Right. And I think about having boards, and one of the things that we developed is the CTE board, and we have standards, and they help inform what the workforce should be. And one of the things that we do that some people don't like is that whatever CTE programs we have statewide are open to all kids. Meaning that if your district doesn't have it, it's your responsibility to make sure that that child goes to whatever district has the variety of courses. As you can imagine, there's that competition that exists, but it is open. And I think that when you bring industry to the table, you also make them responsible as a co-partner in doing this work together. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing right now play out as we move forward. But I feel very grateful to be part of this very intellectual conversation with the leaders in this area. But I just want to say that we're in a critical point that we do have to make the change. And we don't want to read about this 10 years from now, 20 years from now and say, hey, we've known all along, we just didn't do it.
And let me close with a vote of thanks to the commissioner. She won't say it, so I will. She's one of the most courageous leaders in the United States. not anyone would have invited us in to see the most troubled district in her state and spend weeks analyzing it. Still fewer would then have talked to the community for months and developed the kind of exciting opportunities that she had. And the reason I say that is not to do any false flattery, but to say we are in dire need of courage among our leaders. Andreas has pointed out exactly why, because we have to move behavior and expectations and beliefs. And we are not going to do it hoping somebody else does.
Can I say though, David, in closing, that we have hundreds of thousands of people in our schools who are trying to do the right thing every single day, and which is what made me hopeful as a superintendent, and it makes me hopeful now that with all the dysfunction and with all the challenges,
they just need courageous leaders.
There are so many people who give their soul every single day, and whatever it is that we do, we need to have them with us, or this work is just not going to pay off down the.
Got it. I agree. And last word, Norman.
And critically, we are at one of the most difficult moments that I can remember in my life with respect to education, that people inside of our schools are really overwhelmed with all the challenges that they're dealing with through COVID in this particular moment in time. And people are really, really struggling, really tired, really need help. And there is more money being presented by the federal government to the K-12 system than we've ever seen in our lives. And we've got to figure out how to utilize those resources over the next couple of years to address the agenda that we've put forth, or we're going to be struggling after that. So let's hope that we can do that.
Thank you all. Thank you,
you,
everybody. Thank you, Michael, for bringing us together. Commissioner, thank you for joining us. A privilege to be with you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.